correct? Yeah.
Tourism is the next one.
Tourism, thank you. An update. Aha.
Mr. Chairman, just given the balance of submissions, the recommendation is that there's support for Hawke's Bay tourism is acknowledged and no change to the annual plan.
Happy to move, Councillor Scott. Seconded, Councillor Rose. Anyone wish to speak?
Mr. Chair, we during the annual plan meetings had quite strong representation at the cafe meeting in Napier, with the expressed intention that they wanted Hawke's Bay Regional Council to withdraw totally from funding tourism. And I think that the submissions highlight the range of views here and the support by quite a wide variety of people for the direction it's going. But also note in the submissions that I'd like to see the funding continued beyond the commitment that we have, which will come up in the next round of planning, I guess, and see it increased. So I think at this stage it's good to note the support that there is for the direction that the Regional Tourism Association is taking, and that we're making progress in that direction.
I actually think you need two resolutions on that one.
Hang on, Councillor. Hang on. We're second to hear. Wish to speak?
Yeah, I think you need two decisions. One for the supporters of Hawke's Bay tourism, and then you need a separate one for David George to thank him for his submission, acknowledge the information that he's provided, but make no change.
Well, I can cover that in a letter to him personally. He wrote me one last night.
Yeah.
Any other speakers?
I mean, he does have a point, and I think Hawke's Bay Tourism's got to keep front of mind the fact that commercial accommodation is under real stress and pressure.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, it's probably a question, given Councillor Scott's point that they come up for next year for the end of the funding round. By the time the next annual plan is through, it is 30th of June effectively, or about the same time next year, which is a really tight timetable for Hawke's Bay Tourism to know if they're still alive as of the 1st of July. Is it anticipated to bring that conversation earlier and with a recommendation into the annual plan?
The next annual plan?
Yeah.
Well, the discussion will start January, end of this year. January, yeah, the normal round. Councillor Curtin.
I think at the end of the day, we ought to have, and in any earlier discussions with Hawke's Bay Tourism, focus on the output we expected, which is an increase in. There's no way around it. The numbers matter, and you can put as much gloss and you can have as much emotion and feeling towards the organisation, but there's a reality they didn't deliver. And when you look at those figures, you can carve into it all of the domestic accommodation figures that they conjured up out of thin air without too much science. The reality is they didn't deliver, and it seems to me, in my observation of the way councillors are approaching this, is that we're quite happy with that. The expectations we put weren't reached, and a big question needs to be asked: if they weren't reaching those figures, and they didn't, what should we do about that? Now, my own view, and I've expressed it before, is that they are well short of the quantum needed to make a difference. And in many respects, the outputs of tourism, Hawke's Bay Tourism, are somewhat in and out. If you don't get over the threshold for quantum of spend in that environment, you might as well give it away, because the impacts are not there. They're only marginal impacts. which can be achieved without 850,000 being spent. So my question is, really, this council, in not attending to and insisting on the output we asked for, and that is tourism numbers, are doing them a disservice by not saying, you haven't delivered, why haven't you delivered? Either go home, pack up your tent and go away, or alternatively, what quantum do you need to make it work? And my own view is that a discussion needs to be had around that, and my projection is that another $1 million would not go astray in meeting the sort of objectives it's set for itself and are never going to meet while this council satisfies itself with low turnout and a lack of coherence with its set objectives for the organisation.
To respond to that, the issue of numbers is a challenge in itself. Mr. George fronts up with numbers every time that Annie can't quantify or justify or find out. He challenges her figures all the time. The feeling is there's been an increase in activity. Whether the KPIs are being met is debatable in my mind. I think they're there. But respectfully listen to Councillor Curtin's view. He has an experience in this area. They're hard yards at the moment in a recession. So, I think the recommendation as it sits there, the answer to Mr. George and his followers or his like-minded group will be forthright and fulsome, if that satisfies any issues there. But the resolution is quite simply that, and I'm happy to support that.
Mr. Chairman, in summing up, I would like to note that the commercial accommodation monitor is used quite frequently. It is not a measure just of tourism. The traditional traveller in a motel has in the past been a business person, and that style of business has changed considerably. The internet, the ability to source things via the internet, has meant that no one comes around knocking on your door with their little bag of samples anymore. And there has been a vast change in that aspect of it. Couple that with a vast change in the variety of accommodation available, and again, the internet has changed this. What family now doesn't get online and try and find a house to go and stay in because they've got more facilities when they do it? So the type of accommodation has changed considerably. And I note in one of the submissions it said the number of beds available over the 10 years has doubled. But in that time we've seen a cutback in the business traveller. So yeah, there is going to be an impact. So I think it's very hard to lay a change in business style at the feet of Tourism Hawke's Bay. I do note that there was quite a wide range of tourism operators commenting on the value that was added into bringing dollars into the area, and therefore I'm pleased to see that we are continuing to fund it for this year, and I hope to see it funded beyond that. The suggestion that perhaps we should be adding another $1 million onto it when we're slashing budgets is a little bit harder to justify.
Thank you. I'll put that motion then. All those in favour, please say aye. Contrary, no. Carried. If we go back to page 34, resource management charges, there are a number of questions around the 36 charges to be directed to Mr. Maxwell, starting with Councillor Douglas or Rose, one of you.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, were you here when Diane Vesti and others presented?
Yes.
Okay. Well, there was some conversation about Section 36 charges, not being understood, both the architecture behind them and their variation year on year, given the workload. Remember we did the shifts of various funds, carry forwards and so That was one question. Is there a way of which communication could be improved? And the second one is the architecture itself has been in place now for 3 years plus. I was updated before, of course it was independently done at the time apparently, and I remember submitting on it whether it's time to review them in the sense that they are not quite catchment based, but they're certainly project based in some senses, as opposed to averaging across all consent holders or something like that. Do you have any views of how that could be managed? Because there certainly is disquiet, usually from misunderstanding, not from, you know, a fierce let's go and lynch a council member or something like that, at least not that I'm aware of. But, you know, so I don't think it's fatal, but I'm just saying, well, how do we sort of get at some of these issues that appear to be presenting here?
So if I address the first question around communication or education, that's something that we've put in my 2 years here now an enormous amount of energy into. We have direct communication and contact with the group that Diane Vesti represents on a twice yearly basis at a minimum, where these sorts of things are explained to leadership within the industry. We communicate with them quarterly through our In the Zone publication, and I just reviewed incidentally this morning after hearing from Diane the latest publication that includes a full page on science, zone-based science water charges and what they are and why we do it. I take the point that it doesn't go into the detail of what we're doing by catchment, and certainly that level of detail isn't there if they wanted to know what's happening in their backyard. We haven't gone to that level of detail and certainly could. We just recently had a stand and staff at the Eastern Hawke Field Days. We've attended shed meetings with the industry. We've offered to set up special shed meetings with the industry to specifically address this issue, but that hasn't been taken up. So we're kind of putting every effort into communicating with them, and I guess it's like any of the communication we have with many of the issues that council grapples with or the processes that we manage. It's really hard to connect with all of the people all of the time. I think the bit that's missing now, I think we've got reasonably broad coverage through a range of mediums. I think the bit that's missing now is what we're telling them in terms of the messaging around the value that it brings to them and the council doing it cheaper than they could, but also what we're actually doing and what the timeframes are and how they can access that information if they're interested in it. That's the bit that's missing, and that might be the bit that really gets people engaged if they understand what's happening in the system that they live in. They might connect with it. I mean, it's a really difficult question. We're always open to ways of improving communication with the consent holder, and you know, if there's innovation out there, we'll grab it. I think the bit that's missing, like I say, is just the key messages we're delivering. In relation, sorry, so if you want to explore that, I can pause there. Otherwise, I can answer the second question.
Supplementary question, Mayor. Notwithstanding you said, and partly you were addressing it at the end, that maybe it's not understood perhaps as it in some way. Notwithstanding your connection with the folks who are the leadership, they're still expressing the view that they're confused or whatever. And secondly, speaking just as a consent holder, and we hold, I think, 7 or 8 consents now in different places, we've had no communication because we're not members of fruit growers. Just using that as an example. So actually it's much wider than dealing with established groups. It's basically every consent holder possibly is, and you'll have a list of all of those, I would imagine. Maybe that's another way of getting at the folks who are chattering.
Just out of curiosity, as a consent holder, you should have received 7 copies of In the Zone if you've got 7 consents. So if you haven't, there's a failing in our system.
Or it could be just me.
So certainly every consent holder does get that information via the In the Zone newsletter, and we took that initiative purely as a form of print media that tries to connect with all of them.
Well, I'm educated and obviously ignorant, but I can't afford it.
Okay, well, certainly happy to explore any other options.
The value, it's what's done, where is it, what value does
Yeah.
drivers.
The key message. Yeah.
Can I
And-
just
and-
follow
sorry.
that up though? 3 years into this now, is there things you do differently? That council decision, would it? Is there? You've got you're in the zone, as it were. You've had 3 years of activity or plus, and dealt with the charges, dealt with the issues, dealt with the questions. I'm sure they resurface. Are there things that could be modified or made different, i.e. even technology-wise?